I mean, I get that. Just yeah, every time there's some conference, like the one I was supposed to be in Madrid, and you're like, "Dang you, COVID." So
What was
this
the
week
conference about?
I'm going to Vienna digitally for the phenomenology of religion conference.
Okay.
Um, it
Sounds
should be
good.
fun.
Yeah.
Are we
That's
live yet?
that's not theology though. That's religion.
Yeah, so they all overlap. All right,
Really? What
I'm gonna
Not to all
I'm gonna
people.
what
no.
about Revelation, Tripp? What's your
Well, if you want to talk about that, just let me pin the video to the top of the group real quick, and then um and then I will we can talk about all the special and natural revelation you want, Adam.
Yeah,
All
that's
right.
what I was saying. We have some Bartians on call, so they might see it a little differently. They might see it as
It's Friday. You don't need to get me upset already talking about Karl Barth. That's and though if we get around to it, I'm happy to ask a question of both of you of whether or not you experience the European insistence about the priority of self-revelation of God, namely understood as decontextualized systematic theology, as an assertion of Eurocentric privilege. And because
that must be on
sometimes
the
it comes
final,
across that
that
way.
must be on the final pages of God's self-investment. I mean, I don't divine
It's
investment.
chapter 5. Chapter 5.
There we go. There we go.
Yeah.
Because I didn't get to
Oh,
that.
We hadn't
I
got.
haven't read your book yet, so don't ask me anything about your book right now.
I'm not.
Time.
I'm not going to ask you about that. I'll only ask people questions about that after they've sent me an email saying they liked it, because I don't want you to lie. And
well, I was away, so I haven't had a chance. I'm just wrapped in something else. Okay.
All right, y'all. I'm going to hit record now. People are showing up in the group. They're saying hi. Well, Peter,
What
I know
group
we're
are we
live
doing?
in the Black
Are we live
Theology
right
reading
now?
group. Yeah.
Oh,
but I haven't
we're
hit
live
record.
right now?
Yes.
Grace, look at the upper left of your corner.
You see the red button.
I see the live, but
we're trying to let them know you're human because you're such a brilliant scholar, continuously publishing all over the place. Now they know that like even Grace is human. And
good, nice lighting, Grace. Good lighting.
Oh, it's so many problems. Who? Me?
All right.
Or Tripp?
No, you.
I'm in a hobbit hut. Hello, everybody. This is Tripp, and we are about to have ourselves a fun conversation because not just two of my brilliant friends, but they're also fun and decided to hang out on Friday, which is high quality decision making. You know you're a real theology nerd when you get the email. It's like, when do you want to get on and talk about theology? And you're like, 5 o'clock on Friday. That's when I throw down. So we're glad you're here. Grace G. Sun Kim and Adam Clark are in the house. And we're glad you're part of our reading group again, Grace, and glad you're part of Reverend Jackson getting to visit.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That was so much fun. It went wow, didn't it? I was really thrilled with all that discussion. So it's actually so fun to be back again. Tripp, I think this is my 5th one this year. I think it's my 5th one with you this year.
I know
I didn't count all the other ones last year. I know Adam's been on forever because he's doing this whole reading group, but I'm not even part of the reading group. Well, and this is my 5th homebrewed with you.
I know you're moving up the rankings. So like of total downloads ever, like the last episode, Grace, you crossed 300,000 downloads of if you add up all the homebrewed episodes you've ever been on.
Wow.
What happened?
So so you know how you've been on
the other homebrewed one?
Yeah, you've been on, let's see, you came on the first time to talk about your before you ever were a homebrewed book. You came on to talk about Spirit, Asian Feminist Theology. Then you talked about the Gangnam Style book. Then you came on like 3 times during the homebrewed book. So this is like your 8th time. But if you add up all of the episodes, you've passed 300,000 downloads.
Grace, you need $1 from every download. You need $1.
Me too.
I am so thrilled. I remember last time when I spoke at the American Church in Paris. And then I asked them, how did they invite me? And then they said it was because of my interview with you on Homebrewed. And I was thrilled. And I know you weren't happy because you were the one interviewing me. But I got the invite.
Well, I'm now closer. My plane flight will be closer when COVID's over. I'm happy to go to Paris, you know. So if you're in Paris,
yeah,
I love baguettes.
We'll go to Paris together. Yeah, we'll go to Paris together. This is so exciting. Adam, we'll all do this Homebrewed in Paris one day.
That would be great.
Paris is like my favorite place in the whole world. Yeah.
Count me in.
Well,
after Seoul.
So, but before we jump in, there are a couple people in the group who are new to Homebrewed because of the group, and they said they loved what you brought in the last conversation, but they wanted to get to know more about you. So, not assuming people have listened to you talk 7 or 8 times, maybe you could introduce a little bit about yourself, how you became a theologian, and got interested in like the topics talk about, the different liberation theologies, Asian theology, intersectional theology.
Okay. I hate talking about how I got into this, but anyway, you know, I did my MDiv. I grew up in Canada. I did my MDiv at Knox College. And then during that time, I had so many questions because growing up in the church, you're drinking. What time is it there?
10 o'clock.
It must be really late there. Okay. Anyway, go ahead and keep 8 o'clock, keep drinking. Yeah. So, you know, doing my MDiv program, I was asking a lot of questions about who God is, in light of my own personal experiences of racism and sexism. So that led me to, okay, why don't I just continue studying? So I did the PhD, and you know, I graduated in 2001, and I'm still wondering and asking tons of questions because, you know, Tripp and Adam, you know, the more you know, the less you know, or the more you study, the less you know. So I'm still on this journey to figure things out, and I'm, you know, I think most of my work is centered around spirit. But you know, it touches on so many things. So that's why I'm actually very excited. When my Intersectional Theology, I co-wrote it with Susan Shaw, and it's really been taking off. Centered on pneumatology. It touches on Asian American theology, on feminist theology, on climate justice work, on so many different areas. And then so this intersectional theology book that I co-wrote, it just kind of brings it all together. And I feel so relieved that there is actually a word for it, because I've been doing this for so long and I couldn't figure out what I was doing. But then coming to write the book and putting it forward, I realized this was what I've been doing for a long time because of my own struggles with racism and sexism. So with Adam today, we can probably talk more about the racism, in particular the anti-Black racism that's happening today in the US. I know there's people around the whole world listening to your podcast, but here in particular in the US, because of that's happening, and then the anti-racism that's happening because of the pandemic, I think today's conversation, you know, I'm looking forward to it because there are so many things that kind of come together, and we kind of all need to work together to solve some of the big problems that we're facing here in the US and around the world.
When you think of today, the anniversary of 9/11, and that like adds a whole nother layer, I think, to the moment. And this afternoon when Elgin, our 12-year-old, got back from school, he's an American, right, in Scotland. So the two things he's like, what do you say to this, Dad? One was a kid who's like, oh, you're an American, you're just racist and like to shoot people. And another was them asking, what happened? What were your parents doing on 9/11? Were the two questions he got asked today. And there's been a lot of moments like that living in another country, another context, where, you know, especially your kids notice the way the legacies, good and bad, from America get played out in other contexts. But when you think of our current crises and then looking at how we responded as a people to 9/11, like it, setting it in that context just makes me think we don't know what to do with power and fear and change and otherness, and it made me like more depressed, thinking just like, when did we do it right? Like that went wrong. We end up invading a different country than one's related to it. The church rallied around a war, and I don't know. It just made me discouraged. I think y'all have to fix that. It's really overwhelming, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it is overwhelming. And, we are recording this on 9/11. I think on 9/11 and those big events, we all know or we remember what we were doing. So if your child asked you what you were doing, what I was doing was I had my second child that year. So she was born in March, and 9/11, she was about 6 months old or 5 months old. And I was breastfeeding at the time. And that was the only time I ever watched TV. You just sit there and you just breastfeed and you watch TV. And that came on TV. And I said, that can't be real. So it's like, how, like, was it a movie? It's like this surreal event happening. And I was living in Canada at the time. And it was so sad to see. And then the aftermath of the invasion and going into war. There's a lot of theologians who have commented on 9/11 and how Americans reacted and how we always react to certain things like this. And, as a Canadian, for me, it was very easy to criticize the US as a Canadian citizen living up in Canada. And then now that I'm here and I'm dual citizen, I'm in the middle of it now too. So, but I think it really does require us as people of faith, as Christians, what are we to do with power? What are we to do when people are doing something against us? What do we do to others? I think it raises so many questions because when I think of that event, it reminds me of the Korean term Han, HAN. And I think, Tripp, you brought it in your latest book, right? I think you talked about Han. And there's a lot of people, and then I know Adam with J. Syria, maybe in the 90s or about 20, 30 years ago. And when he was introduced to the word Han, Han, before I say what James Cone said, Han is this feeling of unjust suffering. So something that is done to you as an individual or as a group, as a people. So people like Koreans or against African Americans here. So there's unjust suffering that people experience because of unjust systems. So this unjust system of racism or sexism or homophobia, those things. And it's this really crushing it really crushes your heart and your whole being. So it is, we Korean American theologians use it in our own theological kind of discussion to help us articulate this feeling of suffering that is placed upon us just because of who we are. So, and this Han can be passed on from one generation to another. So when we think about those who are upset with American policy or how we go and invade and how we colonize in different, modern forms of colonialism, these other countries or groups of people are experiencing Han because it is this misuse of power, taking their resources so that we can live better, so that we can, eat better and we can drive bigger cars and etc. So there is this feeling of Han. So in that event of 9/11, some Korean American theologians were saying people have so much Han against Americans, what Americans have been doing in their policies around the world, thinking American, we're the best country, we can go and liberate anybody we want, etc. Now people do experience Han. So when you experience this Han and you can't release it in a positive way, in a good way to get rid of this unjust suffering, this feeling of unjust suffering, then retaliation can happen, or bad things can happen, or they will do something in return to what you did to them. And so people have analyzed 9/11 in that way. The mass amount of suffering that Americans have placed on other countries. I think of Korea. Korea is divided because of US and Russia, the Soviet Union coming and dividing. We're the only country that's divided in the world. We're still divided 70 years ongoing, and this war there's no peace treaty yet. So, and then going back to James Cone, when James Cone visited Korea and he was introduced to the word Han, he said, this is very similar to how the Black people have experienced the blues. So in their experience of suffering of slavery, which is unjust, this unjust system placed upon Africans, brought here as slaves. And so they were able to sing the blues or talk about the blues. And he said that in his theological exploration, he thought, wow, this experience of Han that Koreans are talking about and people in other parts of Asia are talking about is so similar to what African Americans are experiencing and have experienced. So I just thought this is a really good way to kind of bring in, today we're supposed to talk about Asian American theology, intersectional theology, and African American theology or Black theology. So I think this may be a good way to kind of come together, that we need the different languages, we need different voices, we need all people at the table to help us on this journey on this theological journey, because the only thing that we have is language, and language is very limiting. So when I learn new terms from Africa or from Asia or from different parts of the world, I think this is so neat, because maybe I was already thinking about that, but never had a word to articulate it or a concept to articulate it. So I'm always thankful. So I think this conversation in your Black theology course is so wonderful. So thank you for inviting me. I wanted to say that at the beginning, I got carried away, but I really wanted to say thank you to you and Adam for inviting me. I think this is such an important conversation, especially now during the pandemic and today as we reflect on 9/11 and what has happened. Thank you for the invitation.
Tripp, I don't think I ever told you, but I was actually in New York City during 9/11.
Oh my!
At the Theological Seminary, and I was
Which seminary? New York?
Union. I was at.
Oh, you were at Union.
I was a teaching assistant for James Cone during 9/11, and I remember that morning because we had class that morning, and my sister called me on the phone and said, and I'd been up all night doing some type of paper, something till like 4 a.m. So I slept a long time. So my sister woke me up and she said, Adam, did you see a plane ran into a building? So I said, oh, that's bad. In my head, I was thinking of like John F. Kennedy, the junior, senior, the one who had that like single engine plane who had unfortunately hit a building and died. And in my head, that's what my imagination conjured, because I thought it was like a small plane that hit a building by accident. And that was a dominant kind of image in my head. But she was going hysterical. She said, no, I think it's something more than that. And I thought she was just being very, very hyperbolic. And she's like, no, get to a TV set right now. So I got to the TV set, turned on CNN, and still I saw a plane hit again, and I was still like a bit incredulous because I thought it was an accident. And it really wasn't until I saw like the building dissolve all the way down that I kind of had a sense of the magnitude. But I think in times of shock and trauma, your brain automatically protects you from the worst possible case scenario. So I think my brain or my sensory mechanisms were like protecting me because I did not want to believe. And it was very difficult, even though I was hearing people whisper, oh, it's Muslims and this type of thing and terrorists and all this other. I really was thinking, no, this looks like a terrible accident. There's no way someone's gonna do something like that. So I just remember the type of trying to comprehend. So actually, I went to class. We went to class. So I went to class, and I remember there were like maybe about 15 out of 30 students who were in the class. And everybody's on their phone and they're panicking. And then Dr. Cohn comes into the room and he looks around and he says, they're like, Dr. Cohn, are we gonna still have class today? Something happened downtown and then the World Trade Center. And then they start like, talking really fast. And I remember him pausing. And he said this, he said, well, it's up to you. He says, I think theology is best done in a state of crisis and suffering. But if you want to leave, you could actually leave. We could actually cancel class, but it's up to you. So he left it up to the students to make that choice, right? But the students were like, look, Scott, we might do theology in a state of crisis, but we ain't doing it in a classroom in a state of crisis. We going home. So all the students, students just left. They got, you got to pick up your kid. You got to do this. You got to do that kind of thing. So everybody just left. Sitting there that I'm talking to James Cone, we don't understand the magnitude of the situation at this moment. We think it's, we don't even understand it as an attack at this moment. I think we understand it as like something bad happened, but can't wrap. I mean, I couldn't wrap my mind around it so much as I was thinking about actually rushing down to help. And I was thinking, let me get on this subway and try to rush to help. And I was thinking, that's so stupid. I'm gonna everything was shut down and that type of thing. But it's interesting when such a catastrophic incident happens, how your brain kind of doesn't have the capacity to fully comprehend what's going on. So you're miscuing. And it wasn't probably till way later that started to seep in. And the first type of explanation was with Bush. They hate us for our freedom, right? And then, at Union, we started thinking it as a consequence of empire, imperial expansion. We didn't go the whole David Griffin route. Like, we didn't go that far. but we did think there was some type of government complicity in terms of in terms of provoking a reaction, but not necessarily, we didn't go the demolition part, though, that type of thing. That was a little different.
Well, Canadians, so thanks for sharing that, Adam. So in Canada, we were thinking it is a consequence of American imperialism, empire building. And, if we know our history, every empire, empires rise up and empires fall down. So we have to be very careful of our next steps, what we're doing, and how we as America is going to survive too, because we have done a lot of bad things around the world. And I think there are consequences to all the actions that are happening. So anyway, that's very interesting. I know I had another child at Montessori. He was 2.5. And my first instinct, because in Toronto, everybody was saying that whoever did the attack are going to attack Toronto next. That's what was happening in the daytime. So it was like, hurry up and go get your child and out of the school.
Right. But the category was suffering. Like, what do you do in the face of suffering, right? How do you respond to suffering? And all the churches, like, Union, as people don't know, is right next to Riverside Church. So there were all these services at Riverside in terms of that. And it was interesting because you saw people who were playing with marriage or considering marriage get married. You saw a lot of babies being born, like a lot of things that people were delaying. It gave a sense of urgency to, which was kind of an interesting and fascinating kind of response. But it was really interesting to see how human beings respond to catastrophic forms of suffering, and also the government rationale of explanation of why that suffering actually occurred, and trying to create new narratives of how to explain that to a people that were already traumatized by this situation.
Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me just in even hearing how y'all's stories about it and the way you hear it, I think that moment is similar to the moment we're having now, especially and particularly for people of privilege, because when you can't help but acknowledge suffering and violence, then all of a sudden the percentage of people who, you know, if it was their friend, they would recognize it, right? Like, and as long as you can preserve blinders, you do. But when they don't work, you get conflicted once you start connecting the dots at the way at that point, right? Our foreign policy was coming to roost. And where did they attack? The center of our military at the Pentagon and our banking structure, right? So, and then if you think of how the violence of COVID is hitting particular communities, and then the videos of George Floyd and these type of things show the way white supremacy gets put on your phone screen. Like, at some point, like, there's this experience for someone of privilege where all of a sudden, like, the mirror is clear, right? And the temptation, and this is something I've been thinking about, especially in connecting those two moments, is when the relational system is toxic and there's all types of ugliness running through it, right? Like Andrew Sung Park, when he talks about Han, is how it turns the victims into the violators and back and forth, right? And so these wounds then create wounds, and it becomes this intergenerational power. And so now the wound is the story and not even the origin of it, right? It gets its own inertia. And so I think those moments show us just how deep the ideology of it goes, supremacy culture in America, right? We were okay all staying up late to watch bombs explode in Iraq because, and I remember this, I wrote a song about how horrible I felt that this was true, right? But that I saw stuff blowing up at a country I wasn't even sure was related to it. I felt better going to bed that night.
That's interesting.
There was a peace that came in war. Yeah. Now that we could identify the problem and point at it, we can do something about it. And I think that same thing's happening right now, right, with the like rise of consciousness around white supremacy and racial violence. Like, we want something that we can point at and do something about so that we can deal with our anxiety. We don't really want to change the culture. We want to go back to doing something because dealing with that whole relational dynamic and the way it's perverse is problematic. So if you just give us something we can do, we can go do it. And and anyway, and while y'all were talking, it was like those two moments get connected together. Like, we want to turn a relational dynamic into a substance, because then we can go fix it. And that doesn't ultimately address it.
Let me also talk about another dimension of that the marginalized versus dominant populations. And this gets back to James Cone. In 1975, James Cone was invited by a Korean delegation to Japan to hear more about theology. And this is the height of liberation theology globally. And he talks about how the Koreans were much more receptive to the themes of liberation, especially of Exodus, than the Japanese were, right? He says, I really couldn't, he says, visually, I couldn't really discern the difference between a Japanese person and a Korean person, but when I saw how the questions that were asked, the Koreans were so much different. I could tell by the way they talked or the way they engaged with me that there was such a difference because of the particular national history. Right?
So to give the history of that is Korea, this tiny little peninsula between Japan and China, was almost always constantly invaded by Japan or by China. So when we look at today and we see the American imperialism, the Japanese imperialism invaded Korea, wanted Korea. They still want Korea, and Korea is not going to give up, but this long history of invasion throughout all of, when I look at I don't know the whole history of Korea, but we're a very old country. this constant invasion by either China or Japan. So it is this woundedness that Koreans have felt for thousands of years. And, you know, in the most recent history, when Japanese had invaded, you know, Korea was colonized from 1910 to 1940, 35 or 45. I can't remember the date right now. But then during the war, they took young women. So some were like 10 years old, very young, you know, some 13, and maybe a little older teens, 18, 19-year-olds. The older ones, they took them, lying to them, saying they're going to be working in factories. The younger ones, they just kidnapped or just stole them from their mother as they're walking down the street. So many kids were missing, many young girls were missing. And they took them as sexual slaves during the war. So Japanese soldiers were all, you know, spread around Asia, and they needed these, so they were called comfort women. Over 200,000 comfort women were taken, and so many were on their way. The older women realized that they were going to be sexual slaves. So they either committed suicide or they tried to endure when they had enough, when they were so overwhelmed with disease. You know, I've heard testimonies. So these young girls were dragged out naked, and guns were kind of, they were shot through the vagina. So there were many ways to torture these young girls. They did it in front of the other girls. And so when we think about this, and they're not just raped once a day, they're put in these small quarters, and the reports were they were raped 50 to 80 times a day. You know, that alone could kill you. So that's why so many of these young girls died. So we have this history where the Japanese raped young women and young girls. They colonized us. So we as a country have always felt Han, and much of it was because of Japanese colonialism or Chinese invasion. China wanted us to. We're a small country, but they both were fighting for us. So when we think about liberation theology, that's why in Korea, you know, the sense of liberation, wanting to kind of come out of this imperialism that the Japanese, you know, when they invaded Korea, they said Koreans can't speak Korean, you got to take a Japanese name. Our culture was destroyed. They killed our queen. That's why there's no more monarchy. They killed everybody in the royal family, but they killed the queen. So, you know, the whole destruction of Korean culture was under the Japanese. So yeah, there's a lot of hate towards Japanese, a lot of animosity. But you know, this is the work of liberation. Something needs to be done, because if we don't do it well, so this experience of Han that I talked about earlier, 9/11. So these countries or peoples who are angry with because of our foreign policy, of what we trade, you know, they want to get back to us. They want to get back at us. So that's a very bad way to release one's suffering or one's experiences of Han. So Christians, liberation theologians, we want to find positive ways to release this Han. So, you know, these young comfort women, when the war was over and they were liberated, and, you know, many of them were able to go back home to Korea. You know, there were somewhere in the Philippines, they were all over Asia. They were just scattered all over. Some of them didn't even know where they were. So many of them who still survived try to go back home. You know, because of the honor shame system in Korea, many of them could not go back to their families because of the big shame of being raped daily, 50 to 80 times a day. So they lived this kind of single life. Many of them didn't get married because of the shame, what happened to them. So, you know, as these women lived, there's a lot of Han. So they need to be able to release it positively. So, you know, everybody works for their Han. And as people of faith, we look to Christ or to the Spirit to help us release this Han. Because if you don't release it well, then something like 9/11 happens, or, you know, the riots are happening right now. And, you know, because people are angry, people are suffering, people are experiencing Han in their lives. And there has to be a way to release it, because this racism that's so embedded in our culture and society, the systemic racism, we need to deal with it. Otherwise, more and more people are going to die. more catastrophic events are going to happen here in America. So we have to sit back and say, how are we going to tackle it? And as Christians, and those who are listening or in your Black theology course too, everybody needs to answer this question. How are we going to fight this racism and also the sexism that is so embedded? How are we going to do this? So, a lot of evil has happened in this world because of these isms that are just so pervasive in our culture and our society. And so as liberation theologians, what are we going to do? So, with my work on intersectional theology, none of these issues are a standalone issue. That's very clear, that it's not just a racial justice issue. That's tied in with economic issue. And that's also tied in with gender justice issue and also climate justice issue and homophobia. All these issues are all intertwined. So I think the quicker we understand the intersectionality of these issues and intersectional theology, when we were doing this, we give credit to the Black lawyers and the Black thinkers that were already using intersectionality as a way to understand their own lives. That when the Black women were talking and reflecting on their experiences of racism, it was not just racism, it was also sexism. And it wasn't just sexism, it was also the ableism and economic situation and everything else. So, we are indebted to the Black women thinkers that were able to articulate this. And so, when we're doing this theologically, understanding that these issues are all intertwined. So when we're talking about anti-Black racism, that's all tied in with the anti-Asian racism that is happening so rampantly now during this COVID-19. So I think recognizing this, and as Christians and as people of faith, whatever faith that you belong to, how are we going to tackle these issues, because they all intersect? How are we going to release people's harm that people around the world are experiencing because of us trying to build this empire, trying to colonize other peoples and other countries? How are we going to deal with it? These are all intersecting issues, and we have to deal with it. So hopefully Adam has an answer to all these problems that we are experiencing. It's enormous and not forward.
There's the screen froze, I think.
Was I breaking up?
Yeah, I think you just.
So did I break up? You didn't hear?
We can hear you
now.
now.
I think we heard it, but it froze.
Okay. But did you hear what I was saying? I hope. Okay.
Adam's gonna solve all your problems. That's what you were setting him up for.
Well, part of the thing is what are the themes, right?
Great. I might have to change location, but
yeah, she keeps freezing up. Part of the theme in terms of at least Black Asian theology dialogue has been
solving all my problems. Yeah.
What are the similarities and differences, right? And the similarities in terms of the challenges that have been like poverty, right? Poverty within the Asian world, poverty within the African world, Black world, and also a strong emphasis on culture and religion, right? Drawing from religion and culture as a way of constructing theology. Like you keep mentioning Han, which is very similar to African-centered things of ancestors, right? In terms of that. Like, so the fact that we draw on our cultural sources, right? And also have to experience like this kind of material deprivation has been the basis for carving out a theology that's carved out of our culture, right? And that's what gives it, both Asia and the Black world are so diverse. I mean, Asia is like a term that covers so much vast territory, right?
Yeah, and we are actually half the world's population. That's how big we are. If you put China and India together, we are half of the world's population. I think half of Asia is also maybe Chinese. That's how big China is too. Yeah. So we are huge in the world. But then, earlier, Tripp, you were talking about marginalization. Sorry to cut you off, Adam. And the fact that as immigrants, or those who have been here for 6, 7, 8, many generations here in the US, still this marginality happens to us. So to us Asian Americans and to African Americans, to any people of color, we are marginalized because of the white superiority, white supremacy that's happening here in the US. So even though I am half of the world's population, and I know about 10 years ago or 20 years ago, Time magazine had a cover of the most popular or most common face on the planet. I don't know if you ever saw that cover. And that cover is the man of a Chinese man. I'm actually going to change location, so just keep talking. I'm going to stop the video.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, well, what I was going to say in terms of that is really talk about some of the similarities, global similarities, and some of the differences. But really the key thing in terms of not just with Asian, but with all different theologies is what is the basis for our common thinking about Christian faith, right? Liberation or freedom has been the most widespread global theme. There's something at the gospel that speaks to people needing to be free. What freedom looks like in different territories, may differ, right? Like that's very perspectival in terms of how we actually how we actually come at that. But really, it's grounded in the very kind of deep theme of liberation. And I think that's what's really calling for the moment when we look at Black Lives Matter, right? Like there's a new way of trying to think about and deepen the dimensions of how we understand what freedom means. And now our challenge is, well, what does that mean theologically? I've said before, we need to draw from the prophetic tradition of Christian faith, right, to meet the challenges of our time, and really carve out a new way of thinking and doing theology out of our prophetic lenses. And I think that's where we have to meet the challenge of the moment with Black Lives Matter, with COVID, and with this type of election that's really an election about whether we want to, what kind of country are we going to become, right? I think that's the key question.
I apologize again, sorry about my freezing and so forth. Hopefully this is a better location.
Well, it's fine so far, yeah, it's fine so far.
Okay.
Nice, it's good lighting too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I apologize.
No problem.
That I was breaking up, but yeah.
So one of the questions that got sent in, I think fits here, and it's good for both of you to respond. And it was a question about how from your own kind of traditions and context, do you understand God's solidarity with the oppressed? And you started to talk about Han and understanding what that nature of the woundedness looks like, but how as Christian theologians does Asian Korean theology understand divine solidarity, and how does that compare, contrast, connect with Black theology understandings of divine solidarity?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question. So I don't know if I'll be able to answer it well, but when I think about when you read scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, God is always with the oppressed. So when we think about the Exodus story, they are as slaves and they're crying out to God for liberation. God hears them. So God is always hearing those who are oppressed and are marginalized. And when we see the incarnation of God through Jesus, so his life on earth, Jesus was there with the marginalized. When we look at the story of the anointing, in the Luke passage where this sinner woman comes to anoint, everybody's all angry, the rich guy sitting in the room, this was a nice dinner, and then this woman comes in. Jesus does not ignore, but says, this will be done in her memory. So we will remember her. We don't know her name, but we will remember her. So always Jesus is with the side of the oppressed. And I think about, Sally McFaig had always used these models of God and God as parent. I think as a parent, I've got 3 kids. They're all kind of equally the same. But suppose I had like 10 kids and one of them was beaten up all the time or had some problem and people teased him or her. I would always be more concerned about that child than the other 9. As a parent, you just do that. And so if we're going to use this image of God as a parent, God created this world. Okay, so God created the whole universe, beautiful. Genesis, everything was good. God, day 1, God created and it was good. Day 2, everything was good. God is happy. Everything is good. And now these human beings are on their road to destruction. We rape the earth. We kill animals for fun. We eat too much. We consume too much. We buy too much. We produce too much. And we just don't like each other. We go to war. We make slaves. There's so many different forms of slavery today. So we do this, and I can see God looking down. Everything was good, and we are on a road to destruction. Of course, then God will side with those who are marginalized and oppressed. Of course. And that's why it's just, we with power, or whoever holds power, needs to share that power, needs to empower those others who have less power. We need to build each other up. I think God is always with the oppressed and shows us what we are to do. So many, I'm at a Quaker school, so I'm at Earlham School of Religion. I'm not a Quaker, I'm ordained Presbyterian, PCUSA. And I look at different denominations and I think some people have it really good. Like they understand it better than others in different ways. So being at Earlham, I understand sometimes as a Presbyterian or other denominations, we get so hung up on these doctrines, the correct teaching. So when I was doing my PhD up in Canada, I was actually part of the doctrine committee for the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And I was on it for, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years. I didn't know what I was doing because I don't know much doctrine, but we are so into doctrine. We want right teaching. We want to do everything in good order and so forth. Well, as Quakers, I don't want to generalize people, but one thing with Quakers, they don't have doctrine. They are looking at it more holistically. They're not so tied up with all these little dogmas and doctrines, and we get so tied up with it. They want to do God's will. They want to hear God's Spirit speaking. They want to be peacemakers. And maybe that's what we need to do. Not so tied up with, do we have the right doctrine? Do we understand Jesus correctly? The Christology, is it correct? Or can we just believe and just do what Jesus told us to do, which was to go feed the poor and the hungry, clothe the naked. But instead of the actions, we are so focused on these theological perspectives of who God is and that we get it right. I'm not saying that's bad too, but I think we need some balance to get a more holistic kind of perspective on who God is and what God requires of us. So these days, I'm working on several projects and I get all my projects mixed up because I opened up a whole file folder. I don't know what I'm doing right now. But one thing, I am kind of immersed with this Black theology and, wondering what does God require of us? It's not so much, are we worshiping correctly? Quakers worship in silence, many of them, but then they do have the program worship. So, but we sometimes get so wrapped up, is this the correct way of worshiping? Is this the correct baptism? Correct way of serving communion, etc., etc. And I'm telling you, Presbyterians are all into doing it correctly. That we sometimes miss the point. Micah says to walk justly and humbly and do what is right in God's sight. We miss that. And today, if God's telling us today to do what is right in God's sight, then it is really to be with the marginalized, to understand how marginality works, understand how white supremacy works, understand how patriarchy is lived out in the church and reinforced by many churches, understanding all that and working towards this liberation. So I'm always excited that there are so many of us who are doing liberation theology, different forms of liberation theology. And so we kind of need to work together, cross disciplines, so that we can kind of help one another in our own communities. I need more language from the Black community. I need more language from Hispanic and the Native American friends and scholars have taught me a lot, and I appreciate all these different teachings, because once we hear all these different voices, it only enriches us and it helps us to get a bigger understanding of God. So God, you know, I do more spirit, but if we're talking about God and God is so immense, how can we understand the fullness of God? We can't. We never will. And Augustine said, if you understand God, then that is not God. So we gotta keep reminding ourselves we will never understand, but we still strive to understand the fullness of God. And now I don't know if I actually answered the question.
Well, I mean, when around like thinking through how you understand divine solidarity, like in one sense, like you emphasize that like all the different liberation theologies recognize that God takes sides. And when God does in scripture, it's not like God's like, Pharaoh, would you like to play golf today? Because, that'd be cool. And I think the other side, and this might be something, I'd like Adam, if you want to say something about, is there's like the solidarity, like God takes sides, and if you listen to God, you will too, right? But then there's how you understand God's solidarity in our suffering and in our woundedness, how you understand the cross, the incarnation, God's presence in
I think God suffers with us.
Mm-hmm.
If God is in solidarity with the oppressed, with the marginalized, with those who are suffering, then God suffers with us. And that's, when you mentioned Andrew Sung Park earlier, so his book, The Wounded Heart of God, that, we as Koreans use the word Han, but then that piercing of the heart is also experienced by God too. And where do we see that? On the cross. When Jesus died on the cross, it was not like, oh, he didn't experience pain. There was pain, there was suffering, physical and emotional. His disciples all abandoned him. Right? They left him. He was alone on that cross. They beat him up. They put the thorns on his head. He was suffering. And so he does suffer with us. And I think that is, God is in solidarity with us who are suffering. When women are raped, women are sexually assaulted so frequently. With the Me Too movement, it's highlighted more, but still we have a hard time when we speak up. And you see this in the elections too, both with Biden and with Trump, Trump's being, but anyway, it's just, God is with those who are suffering because God suffers with us. And so, I think when we see that God is suffering with us, I think part of our task is to prevent the suffering that's happening here in this world. So many people are suffering because of climate change. California, all the fires happening, they're losing stuff and people are losing lives. This will continue to happen, not just in California, but in other parts of the world because of climate change that's happening. Scientists have warned us in so many ways, but we still fail to take any action because it's not affecting me right now, so it's okay. But yes, it is affecting us in so many ways, and we just don't want to admit it. So I think, we are on this road of destruction. God is with us. God is with us in our suffering. And I think we need to change courses to stop the suffering and the destruction of lives and of God's creation.
When we first got on, I halfway joked with you guys about one of the things that we could talk about in terms of Asian Black unity is Kamala Harris, who has multiracial identity. But your question about God's solidarity with the oppressed actually is applicable here, because there's so much conversation about who to vote for, right, with progressives, about should I actually vote for, does the Democratic Party sufficiently actually address solidarity with the poor and marginalized, that it's worth actually promoting that, right? Or there's a People's Party thing that's going on that's talking about that, look, this system cannot produce the type of results we desire, that is structurally flawed, so much so that any type of actually voting within the system is fool's gold, right? That they're too tied to the corporate agenda to actually represent a certain type of genuine, authentic solidarity, right? And that's been kind of a debate that's happening within the left in terms of that. But I also think it's also about what the Christian vote actually, how do we identify the Christian vote, right? Like, I think that should be the key issue to really talk about the Christian vote, is the idea of solidarity with the oppressed, not the issues of gay marriage and abortion, like you see on the news media and that type of thing. But I think there should be a push to actually put that at the center of what is Christian obligation, what is Christian duty, and that can be expressed within our electoral patterns. So I hope we can actually push to make that something, because progressives have been seen as almost like junior brothers and sisters within the kind of cable news media when it comes to suggestions of how to vote, as if that evangelicals have more of a hold on biblical truth in terms of that. And I'm hoping that this election will provide many of you who are listening right now and people who are reading and thinking critically about this as an opening, especially after Tripp Fuller's former employer, Jerry Falwell Jr., fell from grace so far that there's going to be a vacuum. There's going to be need to actually represent an agenda for people who for the faith vote. And maybe Homebrew can lead that, Tripp.
Yeah, so, when you're talking about the evangelical vote and so forth, I think, who are progressive, we love to point fingers at them, but I think we also need to recognize, there's so many Christianities. So how are we going to kind of when it comes to voting, how can we be faithful in our vote? Because there's many problems, with our progressive Christians too. So I'm getting a little worried. I think there's only about 55 more days till the election. I think that, or around there. And I am getting very, very worried. And I know every election cycle, I tell my kids we may move back to Canada because of all this. And it's a very stressful time for me. So I just hope that we can vote, faithfully, but understanding as people of faith how we understand Christianity too, because the Christianity, there's so many forms of Christianity. And I think Tripp second last episode that we did, I was talking about Americanity, that sometimes it's not really Christianity, but Americanity. We just put an American flag around this and we present it to everybody saying, this is Christianity, but it's not. It's this American philosophy of imperialism and empire building that we present. And it's this false God that we present to America and to the world. So we have to be very careful. I think, there's some craziness happening today.
and I think one of the things that I've just in looking at how people respond, in social media and emailing me, people listen to the podcast, especially ministers, like if you look at congregations that are ethnically diverse, handle this really differently than ones that are overwhelmingly white. And I think part of it is, let's say you are, a more progressive congregation in a white congregation, that you're still like half your friends are white supremacists, right?
Mhm.
Like, and so like in your head, every conversation or every item that's pushed in your head, even if you are like, I agree with everything you're saying, but half my family and friends are now uncomfortable, and I would rather keep you oppressed than be awkward with them. That's the issue, right? And I've heard it in different emails and messages I've received, and and part of it has just been hearing America discussed by where I'm the only American present. Like it has been really shaping.
It's enlightening.
Yeah, and here's like the part of it that I've been trying to think of, like, what is the correlation moment? Like if I was trying to describe it, uh, there, when Solomon actually lets a real prophet in the court, all of a sudden he's pissed. He's like, what? You don't think I should be investing in building weapons and exporting them to a number of my neighbors, maybe playing both sides of a war because I know they aren't going to attack me if I'm providing them military equipment? Like there's so many of these little things you see, like Solomon's like defense mechanism, and the prophet's like, no, you were supposed to trust God the whole time, and now you're treating your own citizens like slaves, right? And what's his response? Get me a new prophet. That's the response. And so like that temptation, get me a new prophet, is the one that I think people in dominant culture who want to be allies, right? Who want to start thinking intersectionally and trust the experience and testimonies of people who they've never had that experience and been in that situation, is that moment where they go, is this voice going to be heard in my court when I make decisions? And then like the challenge you both just gave us, is that voice the one we expect to actually hear the word of the Lord from? That's like a whole nother challenge, right? And I think being clear that it's that difficult is actually a good thing, because until we recognize that so many places of kind of like moderate, wishy-washy, we're with you kind of, if it costs us nothing, don't recognize like that kind of deferring and distancing act preserves the power of those friends and family who they don't want to make uncomfortable, because what they really are doing is not making themselves uncomfortable, not having a conviction that costs them in the people that affirm their identity. Anyway, I've been wrestling with how to think it, and it's just fascinating to hear it because of the podcast from so many people across the country.
You could also make a case just on it's amazing, but I think you have to do intellect. See, I think the gymnastics is on their part, the intellectual gymnastics, because how can you justify? There's an estimation that there's 400,000 dead from COVID by December. That's almost 500,000.
Or January, yeah.
That's about 500,000 people. So by the time it plays out, it may be up to 1 million. I mean,
it's more than 9/11, Adam.
By exponentially, right?
Yeah. It's unbelievable.
That's
so many could have been prevented. That's the whole
right. Well, this is
all
preventable deaths, because it should have been like a pinprick. It shouldn't have been a flood or a hurricane comes in. So the point being is that even independent of ideology, right? If you just talk about basic competence. So to me, the mental gymnastics in terms of defending the vote, and this is also, I have to say, a white problem, right? Because the majority of white people voted for Trump, right? The majority of American citizens did not, right? So the fact that we have a majority of white women, white Catholics, and white Christians that voted for Trump, that to me constitutes a crisis in Christian credibility in the white community, right? Like, how can you make your faith credible when you have somebody who is a brazen racist, right? A brazen incompetent, to actually say that this person you can entrust that person with leadership. He would have
and he has, and the thing with Trump is he has survived everything. I thought soon after he got elected, someone's going to actually assassinate him. He survived all these things.
You bleeped that out, right, Tripp? You just bleeped that, right? It just froze, right? Okay, good.
Oh, what I was saying?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Grace.
No, so he survived the impeachment. He survived, and I feel like he's going to win the next election. He survived everything. Like, you would think there's no way he can, but all the sexist things that he said, and it's unbelievable. So it's like there are so many Christianities, and so Adam, you were saying like the big chunk of white Christian evangelical, it was a solid vote, and it's amazing to me, but we'll see.
The question is, what is the nature of Christian identity? What's the public meaning of Christian identity? We've been having this in our previous conversation about James Cone wanted to debate what the public meaning of Christian identity, and the argument becomes that white people forfeited that because of all they've done. There's such a gulf and contradiction. So when you have people from the South and marginalized communities actually say, okay, this is what it means to be Christian, there's a kind of more of an integrity in it. And we're still at that place about preserving the public meaning of Christian witness. And I'm saying when you see Christian witness connected to someone who's a neo-fascist, right, it just destroys and undermines that credibility. So I'm saying this election has a opportunity to regain the upper hand in trying to redefine what the public meaning actually is.
Yeah. Well, when we study history, when we think about Hitler, he baptized Catholic, and he had the backing of so many Christians and Catholics. They all thought whatever he was doing was right. So it is scary, and history repeats itself. And
that was a lot of coercion, right? Like at least the German Catholic, Christian Catholic, there's a lot of coercion going on there.
Yeah.
Right. It wasn't just like, oh, we think what you're doing great. It was like, oh, if you don't, you lose your job. Like it was like that kind of thing. Because that's a national church, right? In terms of that. But but my point being is that that's part of what liberation is trying to do. The liberation paradigm is really try to talk about what the public identity, what the public meaning. And I think this is one of the key things that are emerging in this election cycle, that Homebrewed and other progressive outlets have an opportunity to actually seize the moment, right, and offer a different way of thinking about it in ways that people haven't thought about in the past, like a kind of decolonizing the very idea of what Christianity has been, and repopulating it with things that could actually allow people more flexibility, humanness, and using intelligible use of history and culture instead of just ignoring, the culture of marginalized folks. Right. So I think that's the part
decolonizing,
of
I think,
this moment.
Adam, what you said is so important, the decolonizing, decolonize our minds. When I think about white missionaries that went to Korea, it was the white Jesus that they brought. I grew up with a white Jesus. Everybody around me said it was white Jesus and white God, and so we need to kind of decolonize our minds, move away from the white supremacy that is embedded also within Christianity, and say, hey, how can Jesus, who was born in Bethlehem, fled to Egypt because King Herod was going to kill him, he was able to blend in there and then come back. This Palestinian kind of Jew, how could he be this white European Jesus that we made him into? So many of the European artists, the painters and the thinkers and the philosophers all made him white, and in turn God became white. So I think this decolonization, what I was taught by missionaries, we need to kind of liberate ourselves from this. And so I hope the listeners too, a lot of the unpacking and the decolonization that happens, and the liberation that needs to happen really needs to happen for us to try to get a better glimpse of this fullness of God and who God is. I think that's a very necessary step.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that has struck me is, and I haven't really thought, I haven't unpacked it, but I feel like there's a pattern, impression remains covered over, is where the victim ultimately, time there's a video of someone being murdered, or every time you point out any systemic thing, what is it? Oh, well, let's talk about the welfare queen or whatever, right? It gets reduced to the individual, where the only horizon of responsibility is what one individual does with their, limited spectrum of options. And then you can blame them for whatever the course is. And like, we have to ask questions differently, right? And I think that's one of the gifts of the book, the Intersectional Theology book. It's one of the gifts of liberation theologies that recognize that kind of, like, idols, like mammon and supremacy culture and such.
Yeah. Well, I think why white supremacy has been so successful is they wanted to maintain the status quo. They were able to sexual white person. So yeah, it's easy to blame. Okay, African Americans aren't doing well because they're lazy. Hispanics aren't doing well because they're lazy. Women are being raped, yeah, because they were wearing such clothing. Of course, they're going to get raped or they're going to be attacked. So always blaming the victim, Tripp, as you said, it happens over and over again. And in doing so, you can maintain the status quo. When we look at the life of Jesus, Jesus didn't come to maintain the status quo. He came to disrupt the status quo. The Roman Empire was there. It was destroying people's lives. They were heavily taxed and they were scared. There were so many restrictions. And I think when we look at what Jesus did, we also, am I breaking up again?
You did that time once.
Oh. Am I breaking up?
You froze for a second.
Oh, sorry. I'm in a better location. Okay. I don't know the internet today. I think there's too many people in my house right now. So many kids in the house.
It's not just you. I had calls with 2 grad students that didn't come back, and just because everyone's doing school from home and things, like, the internet's not used to.
Yeah, I think, it's just, I don't know the internet language, but I don't know, whatever bandwidth circuit or something. So I don't know, sorry to break up, but what I was talking about, but the challenge in the status quo, and I think going back to what you were saying, Tripp, about being a prophet, we need to listen to the prophetic voices. We don't want to push them away. We need to listen to them because they have a clearer voice of what is required of us today. And I think breaking down the evils of white supremacy is so important. And you see this being played out in our churches, in our institutions, in our seminaries. So we need to break that down.
And also, we just had a Kenosha shooting, right? Where the person was shot in the back 7 times, Jacob Blake, and he was blamed, right? He was going for a weapon. He was, suspicious, shot in front of his kids, right? So, the idea of scapegoating, is especially in this administration, right? Like, first it was like the Mexican immigrants, and now it's, largely been Black males, at least in the recent moment. But it's always some type of what a scapegoat does, it like kind of the Girardian type of thing is that, people, will sacrifice something in order to come together over a greater unity, right? Like in terms of that. And what's happened now, you have like dissent from that, where you have a large group of people, the movement saying, look, you are not going to scapegoat. This is not the problem with the United States, right? That's not the source of why you are miserable, right? And what Trump tries to do and others is tries to identify some of the most powerless people that they can other, who are Black and brown people primarily, who are actually, and then white people are able to say, look, this is the source of your problem. is these migrants who are coming across the border to steal your job. This is a source of your problem. These Black people in these urban areas who are causing all this type of crime. And then after that gets identified, you have these type of middle-class white people who come together and are able to try to talk about some type of national unity and a retrieval of a bygone era, right? That they're trying to put on to today. That's why I'm glad to see the type of success of people saying, look, I refuse, I resist, right? And I'm glad to actually see, churches getting more involved in that and actually supporting that movement, because it's a refusal to go along with that, right? But I think the second step needs to be of where is the source of misery, right? We refuse to identify Black and brown bodies in this movement, but now we have to identify, well, where is this misery coming from? Let's get a better analysis. And most of it's coming from these corporate worlds who are making billions and billions of dollars in this type of economy. And there hasn't been a proper way of trying to hold them accountable for the national wealth and the sources of at least economic misery primarily, and also some of the kind of manipulation of the political system. And I think that's the next step that has to go. It has to go. And I think after we stop the neo-fascism of Trump, right, we've got to actually recalibrate our liberationist lens to try to hold the next administration accountable for that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think understanding all these that are intersecting the economic situation, the racism, and all these issues, part of the intersectional theology that Susan and I were working with it always lead to some social justice work. So any form of intersectional work that we're doing when we're talking about intersectionality, it has to lead to issues are all kind of coming together. There's not a single issue, but it's always multiple issues. So when we're talking racism, we have to tackle sexism and everything else. So I hope that as liberation theologians, that will just voices and fight against the evils that exist today. And you can see it politicized in so many ways today.
So Grace, how did Black theology specifically inform your development of intersectional theology?
Well, I think Black women, so Kimberly Crenshaw was a Black lawyer. So she kind of coined the term intersectionality when she was trying to defend a Black woman and recognizing that it wasn't just one issue. It wasn't just because she was a woman, but it was because she was a Black woman. I think she was fired from her job. So I think, there is, when I think about liberation theology or Black theology, so the last thing that we did was with Reverend Jackson, right? And I can't remember whether he said it during the interview or after when we're just chit-chatting, because everything gets blended in my life right now. I don't know if it's, there or somewhere else. But he was talking about Black theology before James Cone. Did he talk about it on the recording? He did? Okay, I can't remember, but he because we talked about it a bit further, and that when African slaves were here, Black theology was there, so he was pointing to the understanding that, Black theology, when Blacks were enslaved, and then when they were trying to go to church, they were only allowed in the church balcony. They couldn't be part of the church. And that's where AME, Bishop Allen started the AME. So the ways of understanding God with them during slavery, this act of liberation that was already happening, and the people were trying to find their way of freedom. So you try to find it in Christianity as they went to church, find it in the way they understood God. So this act of liberation that happened, that was already happening for hundreds of years during slavery, I think that is also a helpful way for many of us who are pressed to understand that God is with us with the oppressed. When I think about the Korean history, American theology, it's very, very new because from about 60s to 70s, I co-edit the book series Asian Christianity in the Diaspora with Joseph Che. I started that with him. It's very, very new. So in the 80s and 90s, that's when Asian American theology kind of came up. And it's late because we have been here in the US from about 1850s. But before that, they were trickling coming in, but a lot of were coming in from the 1850s. And that's not by accident. In 1861 or 60, slavery, bring in the Chinese who are cheap labor as an indentured work, and they were working in harsh conditions. Many people died. Many came wanting to work and then make enough money and go back. They never made enough money to ever go back home. So they ended up staying here, and they had to carry papers around. They were never given citizenship until 1943. So no Asians were allowed to vote until past 1943, which is it's not that long in our history. It's very recent in our history. So, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, the banning of Chinese, and they weren't allowed to buy property, there were so many restrictions. But at that time, people weren't really theologically reflecting. So it's much later with the new wave of immigrants in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s that we began to think about Asian American theology. So it's very new. But when we're doing the Asian American theology, there's a lot of borrowing from Black liberation theology, James Cone, and how he understood God as, God of the oppressed and being in solidarity with the poor. We borrow things from Latin American liberation theology. We need to come up with our own. What makes us a little different is in the sense that we bring our Asian concepts and our Asian words from our Asian history and our Asian countries into the theological realm. So that makes it a little different from Black theology, from Latin American liberation theology, from post-colonial theology. So there are all these differences, but there are similarities. We're all seeking towards salvation, but boring and a lot of read off other liberation theologies to help create our own. So there is a lot of hybridity that's happening. I think there's nothing pure anyway. So there's hybridity happening in all levels of theological discourse. And I think if the end goal is to liberate people, then we need to come together and help him. So I can't remember if that was your original question, but anyway, that's where I'm ending up then.
Yeah, I was just wondering in terms of just informed. I mean, one of the things in terms of dialogue is just really talking about the similarities and differences, where the common ground is and where the need for growth is. So I was just wondering in terms of, how Black theology has informed your particular theological perspective. James Cone writes a bit about Asian theology, but the Asian theology, the Asian theology he writes about is liberationist orientated, right? And I see a lot of contemporary Asian religious scholars talk more about the evangelical dimension in Asia than I do about the liberationist dimension, right? So I think most of it is maybe dated at the time. I'm not sure if there's this type of widespread looking at liberationist themes as they were in the 1970s in 2020.
Yeah, so you're correct, because how white evangelical Christian missionaries went to Asia. So they brought that in, so they exported it to Asia. So let's look at Korea, and we embraced it. They told us everything that we had ever believed in was false. It was false God. Buddhism was wrong. Shamanism was wrong. Confucianism was wrong. Everything was evil, right? And so we embraced it totally. And as we embraced it, white missionaries were able to build the schools and the hospitals. So there was this economic development. So there was nothing, there was no need to question it, because they told us everything, we were bad, and then we're following what they're saying, building the schools and building the hospitals, and we're going to be better. So there was really no sense of, oh, there's nothing wrong with it. So it wasn't that much specifically in Asia. But then once, the Korean government was so corrupt, it was military government, they were killing people, then the liberation did arise. And then that's where Minjung theology came up. Minjung means mass and people. And so it is a theology of the people to work towards liberation. So, that was happening in parts of Asia. So this need for liberation theology. So here in the US, it was still, because the immigrants were all evangelical, or the ones that came and became Christians were very evangelical. I grew up very evangelical. I grew up in a very ultra conservative Presbyterian church in Canada. It was like, I grew up with so many rules. And one of them was, I had to go to church, and if I didn't, that was evil, and I couldn't shop on Sunday. I couldn't do anything on Sunday but worship. It was very, very strict, and that's how my parents raised us. But when I see sexism and racism happening, my focus is, we got to break away from this. Those are the two big things that defined my theological studies during my MDiv and my PhD. Those things were debilitating me, in the sense that I couldn't function properly because of the high level of sexism within the church, particularly in immigrant Korean church, where Asia is already patriarchal, and then you bring that here and it's even more patriarchal. And then the racism that I was experiencing outside the church, those two were huge experiences that was just killing me in the inside and maybe on the outside too. So, then there was a sense of so we didn't have much in the 80s and 90s. So there, it was very important to read Black liberation theologians who were already doing it from the 60s and way before us. So I am very thankful for the work of, Black liberation theologians and Latin American liberation theologians who paved the way and gave us vocabulary and terms and ways to understand God and see God in a non-white lens. So I think it's the different lenses that Black theology gave me and gave other Asian American theologians that we are really indebted to, because our theology, the liberation theology, rose a bit later than.
Now, is that why you were interested in Jesse Jackson, or does Jesse Jackson have any type of relationship to Korea, or what got you interested in writing on him, or with him, I should say?
Well, I think there's a lot of always interests. So, when we look at American history, there's a lot of tension between African Americans and Asian Americans, and that's not.
We should identify that. People don't know this.
Pardon me?
We should identify this because people don't know.
Okay, so yeah, I think we should put it out there. White supremacy created this, and then this hatred towards Asian Americans and African Americans. White scholars in the 60s came up with terms such as honorific whites, almost white, we love you, or model minorities. They came up with these terms. So model minority was a term by white sociologists to say that Asian immigrants were so good, and that term was used to say, hey, Black people, if only you worked harder like the Asian Americans, you'll be fine. Or to the Hispanics, if you just studied a bit harder, you can go to the Ivy Leagues that Asian Americans are going to. So it was this divide and conquer kind of sociological term to reinforce white supremacy. So if people are arguing with each other and hating each other, right? So if people of color, so Asian hate Africans, African Americans, and Hispanics, and everybody's hating the Native Americans, then it serves. It serves good. Everyone else is fighting. I think one of the reasons why Trump is still in power is he works in the same mentality. Everybody's fighting against everybody, and they just fight amongst themselves. And he's still okay. Like, I can't believe he's still president 4 years later. That's just unbelievable to me. He should not be president. He should have been kicked out, or something should have happened. But anyway, he's still president. But I think that's how white supremacy works. It's divide and conquer. You use these terminologies. When we look at Asian Americans, we're not all doing well in these schools. People, if you go to Flushing, Adam, you lived in New York. If you go to Flushing, the poorest people in Flushing are the Chinese people and the Koreans. Some of them are living in these little cubicles,
there's also
with rats running around buildings.
But Grace, there's also that Koreans own.
Pardon me?
There's also the tension is also because of an economic relationship between Blacks and Koreans. Koreans specifically.
Okay, yeah. So that's where the LA.
Well, Koreans own almost the entire Black hair care industry, right? Are you there? She froze a little bit.
Yeah. So So there is this tension happening. So, and it's not by coincidence. So that is happening. So as a liberation theologian, as a feminist theologian, as an Asian American theologian, my interest has been for a long time to break this tension. If we can't just work in our little silos, I can't just sit here and just be happy that Asian Americans are all happy and, I'm just going to write for Asian Americans. I can't do that. So that's why it's important for me to work with other theologians, Black theologians, womanist theologians, Hispanic theologians, Native American theologians. We got to work together, because if we don't work together, this white supremacy will keep doing what it's doing and keep oppressing us, people of color. So that was my interest. And he was interested in Asia. And so we were able to kind of work together. So it's, he's not the only Black person I work with. There's other people. And, I'm hoping to continue this book that I kind of started, with African American voices and Asian American voices. I think those two, because we have the history of the tension with the LA riots. And then when Baltimore happened, there were the Baltimore riots that happened more recently. And, a lot of tension between the Asian Americans in Baltimore with the African Americans. And we have to talk about it. We have to be able to work together and release this tension. And if we don't, we're going to end up killing each other. That's how white supremacy works. Everybody hates each other. You're going to end up killing each other. And so we have to fight these oppressive structures that are put in place. And we need to be able to liberate ourselves and each other, and we have to work together. So Adam, you and I have to work together, and Tripp have to work together, because us in place, right? That's what it does. That's what white supremacy does. You stay down there and everything will be okay. You just be quiet. You're the model minority. Just keep quiet and everything will be okay. That's why there are so few Asian American voices, because we're told to be quiet. We're the good people, you got to stay quiet and just let everybody else create the mess. But, we got to fight the system that keeps us oppressed. And there's multiple layers of this oppression. I'm making it more simple because I don't have a 2-week podcast.
Well, Adam, is there
to kind of come together and work?
So Adam, is there in your own experience, how does the Black church or African American community experience the way racism shows up between different races, especially in America? Because I remember being a part of a number of ecumenical gatherings where the well-meaning, more progressive white people walk into things and not knowing how certain things are going to come across or where tensions might be. And that's definitely one of those topics that you never know exactly how to talk about.
Yeah, well, see, the primary in these racism functions differently in different contexts and cultures. It's context specific. In the United States, the primary antagonism has been Black, whites, and slavery. So they see any immigrant group who comes into it has to kind of fit within a pre-existing racial caste system, right? And a lot of times people who are foreign nationals, of course, want to fit in with the success with the white, right? So there's a certain type of desire, there's a certain desirability to actually fit in with affluent white communities, and then there's a certain types of repulsion of a grotesque Black community, right? So that happens this is not limited to Asia, this is Latin American, any type of foreign national comes in. When you see the type of conflict between Blacks and Asians, it's even hard for me to say Asians because that's such a, there's distinctive Asian groups. What I was
thinking
about,
it's very diverse. Yeah.
Right. What I was thinking about is specifically what you hear in the conversation of the Black community is about the hair care industry, how that's like kind of on lock and it's not Black owned, right? And Black people only have a unique type of hair, right? And don't even control the type of $1 billion industry that's actually kind of manicured to the hair and nail manicures, pedicures, that kind of thing. And I think some of the friction comes out of that type of economic relationship, right? And then cultural misunderstandings that happen within that context, right? In terms of that's of course shrouded with white supremacy, but also the cultural assumptions against that. And I think of myself also when I was growing up, every Chinese was a representative trope for anybody who was Asian, right? Like I came from Syracuse, New York. It was a very small city. So I didn't know anything about Koreans and Japanese. It was just Chinese. Chinese. Yeah. So even the education at that level of understanding the plurality of human groups, right, becomes very, very important in terms of that. So so I think there has to be there's an unlearning that has to happen, right, in terms of the type of ideas that we have, shorthand stereotypes of even our perceptual systems of understanding of typing people. And then there has to be a relearning of how to actually relate to people with dignity, right? And I think that's the work that needs to be done.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of unlearning, unpacking, decolonization of our minds and our theology needs to happen if we're going to be able to work together. Because even in the church, we're all suspicious of everybody. Because the white supremacy, that's what they do with people of color. We become very suspicious. And we don't learn to love, we learn to be suspicious and fearful. So when I was writing my book, Embracing the Other, which is now 5 years old, I can't believe it's that old because I feel like I just wrote it. But embracing the other, that's how, we create the other in so many instances. And then once we create the other, we can do whatever we want with them. We could oppress them, we could tear them down, we can do so many things, but ultimately we are called to embrace. So that's
Grace, how does this work on you're a professor on a college campus, like Black groups and Asian American groups, like how do they get along? Do you see people embracing the other, or how do you see that relating on your college campus?
So I'm teaching in the seminary, so I don't know how it happens in the undergrad, but I know there's always tension. There's tension between Blacks and Asian students all the time, and I think we need to address that. I think it's a very important thing, because once we are able to address it when they're younger, then it's easier to do. So, my daughter is in college right now, and I'm just so happy for her to kind of fight against the anti-Black racism. She's doing more of that than the anti-Asian racism. But, I'm actually very proud of her to be able to do that she sees the need to do this. And it's very, very important for her. So she's speaking up about anti-Black racism constantly. So I'm happy to see
tension. Like I see more ignoring each other. Like I don't see Black people don't really talk too much about it's Asian students as a group in terms of that. Like there's not like a tension in terms of that. It's just more of, I would say there's an indifference. And the reason why I raise this is it's not embracing. They're not embracing. It's
yeah. So I think the indifference is hard too. I think we need to kind of start working towards embracing. I know, when we think about theologians that you and I know too, like some of our friends, I don't want to name anybody, but, when there's interracial marriages, there is so much problem. And I'm wondering, why is that still a problem? But it is, with either Hispanic and Black, or Asian and Black, or white and Asian. There's all these tensions. So I don't know. So
I know why there's problems. I know why there's problems, because especially when you have Black men who marry Asian women.
I know. Yeah.
I understand it in terms of that, but a lot of it has to do with issues of desirability and submission and that type of thing. These type of tropes that get kind of coded onto Asian and Black bodies.
And with Asian women, the problem that, so every group has their own different problems, but when white people, when they view Asian bodies, so the Asian men are desexualized, and then the Asian women are hypersexualized. And this is what white culture has done to our bodies. So we got to unpack that. Why is that happening, etc. It happens because it serves the white people so nicely. They feel no threat from the Asian male, because if you desexualize them, they're not a threat to the white people.
Black men are over-sexualized, right?
Yeah, over-sexualized, yeah.
Right.
So understanding what's happening in this white culture is very, very important. So once we understand why it's happening, then we can work towards kind of dismantling this white supremacy that continues to oppress people of color. We continue to have this tension, or the indifference that you're talking about, Adam. The indifference is not good either. So we gotta work towards the embracing the other.
Right.
And loving one another, because that's ultimately the commandment of God, to love our neighbor. Love God and love our neighbor. That's all we need to do.
Love is not just an affirmation, it's a refusal, right? It's a refusal to be complicit with this. And I think that's what's called for the moment. This prophetic dimension of love is to refuse to go around with ideologies that dehumanize, marginalize, over-sexualize. In terms of that's a prophetic refusal. And I think that's the call of this moment, is to actually access that dimension of love, right? And then the affirmative aspect as well.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I realize we've already gone way over what I told Grace we were going to do.
You told me we'll do 1 hour.
Well, but I should have just let you two talk to each other the whole time. That was really, it was really helpful, and it connected with a number of the questions people put in. And I just, it's been a blast. And in the group, I'll put links to a lot of Grace's books and stuff, and you can go check previous episodes where she's been on the podcast. And you want to say a bit right now, like in closing, about the project you're working on for the biography?
Yeah, so I'm in the middle of doing some theological biography of Reverend Jackson. That was a sabbatical grant I got from Louisville. And, any book, Tripp and Adam, you just think it's going to be this simple kind of book. It's an enormous project that is going way out of hand, and I'm just really overwhelmed by it. I'm actually very stressed, but it happens to me every book. So I'm in the middle of that. So it's like this firestorm I'm in. Hopefully, if I can pass this kind of firestorm, things will be okay. So, but I'm hoping that after, when it's done, and I'm in the middle of it, so it's a mess, that it will be a worthwhile book for people to read. I think his legacy is very important. Not just for the African American community, the Black community, but for a lot of us people of color, because what he has been saying, this economic injustice for Black people, it really does apply to a lot of other people of color. And so it's exciting to learn because he really hasn't been able to articulate his theology. He has been more of a political kind of speaker, but to be able to kind of articulate his theology, he's doing it kind of maybe for the first time too, because I'm pushing him to, but it's very interesting. I find it's life-giving. But as you know, he's an orator. So to put someone's work on paper from orator it's unbelievably difficult. I had the same problem with the Keeping Hope Alive book because he's an orator and those speeches and sermons were written for an oral audience. To put it and rewrite them in a written audience was a nightmare too in itself. When it's done, like now I am so pleased with the final product. It's unbelievable what the final product is. And Tripp, you read it, so you understand. So this is now another big task for an orator, and then going to, and he speaks in short, like sentences. I don't know if they're a sentence, but short phrases that don't translate very well into the written language. So that's another layer. So, but anyway, that I'm okay. I'm still surviving. And actually, on top of that, I'm actually doing another book that I kind of submitted the first draft to Fortress. I don't know what they're going to title it, but the title I have is Visible Theology, or I think maybe it was Invisible Theology. I can't remember. No, but the editor has to get back to me, but I know when she does, I'm going to have enormous rewrites because I can just see that happening. I envision that happening. So I prepare myself because it's going to be enormous rewrites on that book. But I'm very happy with that. That's an Asian American theology book. I want it to be more of my own storybook, but then now it's more of an academic book. So it started in one way and it's becoming something else. But I know there's going to be major rewrites. And then my new book, Hope in Disarray, will be coming out soon. That's been very delayed, not on my part, but on the publisher's part. But I'm excited about that one. So hopefully when these books all come out, your listeners, people around the globe will read them.
Awesome.
And appreciate them.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, thank you for hanging out on Friday. Or it's 9 minutes, or it's 9 minutes to my Saturday. So
okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Adam, for doing this whole Black theology series. I think it's so important. And so I think during this conversation, intersectional and Asian American theology has been so helpful for me. And I hope it's going to be helpful for all your listeners. So thank you. It's been an honor. Every episode I do with you, Hope, is such an, not Hope, with you, Tripp, is such an honor. So thank you for having me. I hope this won't be the last. I hope I'll be back again soon.
I hope so too. Awesome.
Thank you. And thank you for everyone hanging out with us on Friday night. I didn't think people were going to hang out. So hopefully people have been hanging out.
Yep. All righty.
Till next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.